Thank you everyone for attending this virtual program today, Bison and the people on the Northeast Illinois Prairie. Before we start, there's just a couple notable programs I want to share that are coming up at the library. Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m., we have Fair Housing and COVID-19 Pandemic. Tune in for essential information and resources available to the community. Library District is partnering with the Aurora Human Relations Commission and local housing experts to discuss the effect COVID-19 has had on housing equity in our community. Tuesday, November 17th at 7 p.m., Witness Trees. Have you ever looked at a giant tree and wondered what historical events it experienced during its lifetime? Barb McKittrick of the Forest Preserve District of Kane County will share the history of Illinois' witness trees and provide tools for you to discover witness trees in your own area. Register for these and other great virtual events that can be found on our website, aurorapubliclibrary.org/events. And now, happy National Bison Day, everyone. Before I introduce our presenter, I just wanted to lay out how today is going to work. It's a two-part program, and the second part is going to take attendees to the First Peoples Buffalo Jump and the Lewis Clark Interpretation Center in Great Falls, Montana, and also back to Illinois, where Will County Forest Preserve Forest Service will be with us live looking for bison along Route 66. This is going to be a separate Zoom meeting, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. So you'll just follow the link that's in the chat to register. It should only take a second, and then you should get the link to join the webinar automatically after that. So if you experience any troubles with the link, just let us know in the chat, and we'll see what we can do during Joe's presentation. Right now, we're excited to have our presenter, Joseph Wheeler. He serves as the archaeologist and tribal liaison at Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie, part of the Forest Service in Wilmington, Illinois, on the grounds of the old Joliet Arsenal, which is being restored to a tallgrass prairie. And Joe's here today to share with us his knowledge about bison and how they're aiding in that restoration. So Joe, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Colin. And we also have to help out on the chat, you see Veronica Hinke is the Public Affairs Officer and Public Services Team Lead at Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie. And I probably won't do as much Kelly in the second hour when we're with the folks from Montana and Will County Forest Preserve District. We'll talk more about the bison experiment and how they're helping us restore. I'll kind of set the stage, I hope, on the history and prehistory of bison and people on the prairie here in Northeast Illinois. And with that, let's see. And I seemingly am not able to. There we go. So Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie is about 30 square miles. That's the area within the fence perimeter in southwestern Will County. As Colin had said, it's used to be the part of the old Joliet Arsenal, which operated there from late 1940 until 1996, when it was turned over to the Forest Service with the purpose and intent of, there we go, oops. Intent of restoring it to tallgrass prairie. Talk about that more in a minute. First, I invite you all to come visit us. Google Maps told me from Aurora down to us at Midwin. I'll show you a quick map of where we are if you're not familiar. And of course, we have things in place to help everyone stay safe during the COVID event. So, if you're sick, don't come down. If an area is crowded, we have 30 square miles, so look for a little bit less occupied area. Law enforcement or search and rescue, if you get off trail, maybe a little longer to respond. And also avoid high risk activities to keep you from getting lost or injured out on the prairie. Midwin was established through the Illinois Land Conservation Act of 1995, which was signed into law by Congress in 1996. So we're coming up on our 25th anniversary next year of Midwin. And we were tasked within that act to manage the land and water in a way that will conserve and enhance native populations and habitats of fish, wildlife, and plants. That's probably the single most important of the guiding principles when we established we were established as Medewin, because we quickly realized the only way we could do that is to take the old prairie or the old arsenal grounds into a massive, probably 100-year restoration effort. The only way to conserve and do the enhanced parts of the native populations was to do restoration. So that's what we're all about, is restoration. We're also to provide opportunities for land use education and research to allow continuation of agricultural uses and provide recreational opportunities. You can see in the map about where we are, just south of I-55, I-80, if you're taking that route. The ecology of Medewin, even at this early stage of the restoration, we have 172 bird species that either live or pass through Medewin, 1,000 insects, 570 vascular plants, and we only give you the vascular plant count because our botanist, Michelle Pirion, has an ever-changing and massive list of non-vascular plants. So just so I'm not giving short shrift to any of you fungus fans out there, we have a lot of mushrooms and so forth. 27 mammals, 17 reptiles, 8 or 9 amphibians, and some of the amphibians are based on our frog counts, which are done through hearing the frog's chorus or sound, and there's a little ambiguity on that 9th frog as to whether that was an accurate call on. 53 fish species, most of which are not much bigger than your pinky, and we have 22 miles of 4 named streams that run through the prairie. On the left, you'll see education and research. This happens to be in the blue jacket, Professor Mark Schur from University of Notre Dame, out doing ground penetrating radar. This happens to be, as I said, the archaeological work that we're engaged in a partnership with Notre Dame about. And we'll talk more about the site that Notre Dame is working a little later. But we do have other academic and other research going on, everything from seismic arrays to carbon sequestration studies. So recreation, wide range of stuff, 34 miles of trails, 3 hunting seasons, 2 turkey, 1 deer, biking, cross-country skiing, horseback riding, bring your own horse, and a number of public education and recreation programs, of which this is one. We're open 365 days a year. 14,000 acres is now open to the public. Some of the other areas are in remediation, are in restoration, or are Army inholdings where the ground is yet to be remediated. And you get these nice juxtapositions. Since it was the old arsenal, we have a lot of these bunkers, or igloos as they call them, during the arsenal area, like the kids out on the bicycle trip on the left. You're free to climb up on those, and that's probably the best view of the prairie is from the top of one of the bunkers. Cross-country skiing, you see some bow hunters out near Buttonbush Pond, and sharing the road between pedestrian and equestrians and bicyclists, and some roads are designated, some trails are designated just for pedestrians. So, and the thing that brings us here today is Bison. Happy National Bison Day. And since October of 2015, Medewin has been engaged in a bison experiment to see how or if bison help us in our work to restore the prairie. In 2015, we got 27 bison in. The bulls came from Animal Plant and Health Service out in Colorado. They actually were from Yellowstone, so Yellowstone herd bulls, and the cows came from a conservation herd in South Dakota. We've gotten those 27 have multiplied rapidly, and we just had Roundup, and some of our excess bison are now going to tribes and other public institutions such as university veterinary schools, wildlife management schools, and even the Buffalo Rock State Park got a bison last year to replace their second bison that they had there, who had passed away due to old age. So A lot of people are getting a lot of enjoyment, and we're learning a lot, certainly. So this is the popular narrative of the bison, and it's mostly true. The difficult part about the history and prehistory of bison is we tend to extrapolate and think of bison as being evenly and equally distributed throughout history and prehistory, which is not necessarily the case. But at one time, bison did range all the way from the Bering Straits coast of Alaska down to Florida, and from central Mexico up to the New England in the United States, Buffalo, New York, for example, named for the time when there were buffalo. And part of that popular iconography of how we understand bison is, of course, the Plains Indians and the massive herds on the Great Plains and Northern Plains of the United States, extending all the way down to New Mexico. So bison depictions here of religious ceremonies, of bison being hunted from horseback by Native Americans, artist depiction of these massive herds of millions of bison that were out on the prairies. But the part I'd like to call your attention to is in the lower right, because that herds of millions out on the prairies being hunted from horseback is not necessarily the world of northeastern Illinois in late pre-European contact. This depiction is of a middle woodland village in the Illinois State Museum, and it shows that people here are hunter-gatherers with a heavy emphasis on horticulture and agriculture. Let's say they were farmers who hunted and gathered. And we all know about the end of the bison on the Great Plains. Throughout the European American experience here, those millions of bison were systematically reduced to the part there are about 300 bison at the end, towards the end of the 19th century. Last great buffalo hunt on the plains was the season of 1882, 1883, and they were never extinct, and until 2011 remained on an endangered species list. But what is the archaeological and paleontological evidence for the prehistoric or early historic presence of bison? And we're going to focus on Medewin, but not the only place to focus on. We're going to kind of talk about northeastern Illinois writ large. And to do that, we'll take a little look at what happened after the glaciers and before us. We'll take a look at the records we have of early bison. We'll look at what we know about local Native Americans' practice, life ways, and the record that we have of bison. So, of course, we all know, if anybody on this list went to school in Illinois, the glaciers ended 10,000 years ago and carved out the Great Lakes, and then, of course, it became prairie, right? Oh, not exactly, but close. So bison, or the glaciers melted back and exposed the land in northeastern Illinois about 18,000 years ago. And the glacial episode ended way up in Canada around 10 to 12,000 years ago. So that's really the date. It was quite a bit earlier that we started to get changes to the environment than the 10,000 years that we are often, we often kind of do that mental shorthand and say, when did this become prairie? I'm going to point you to something that's really interesting. Should you find it interesting too? And it's called the Neotoma Paleoecology Database. And this is established by a bunch of environmental history scientists and really curated by Eric Grimm, who's now professor up in Minnesota, but had been the chief scientist at the Illinois State Museum until just a couple of years ago. So if you go to you can even Google just Neotoma, and the Neotoma is the family of pack rats. So that's the little joke there. Neotoma it's a pack rat site, and it gathers up all these environmental, all these different proxies we can get for early environment in the region, in the country. And it uses pollen studies, diatoms, middens, isotopic data, all sorts of data sets to help us portray. And the one that we're really going to focus on is pollen, the pollen record of what it says. When you get to the Neotoma site, click on the Explorer button, and that'll take you to this page that you see here. On the top bar of tools in Neotoma Explorer, there's a little white irregular blob, and that stands for water and ice. Click on that, and it'll bring up the other one, which will allow you to look at when you zoom down to the area of interest, and I zoomed down something that would cover both Aurora and Medewin. And that window, you can kind of incrementally tune what was the glacial and water coverage at various increments through history. And this one shows what it was like 18,200 years ago. And you can see that both Aurora and Medewin are no longer glacier covered. So the pollen studies, because pollen falls on the surface of waters, ponds, lakes, bogs, and fens, and then sinks to the bottom, into the muck at the bottom of the lake. And then we can take cores of that muck at the bottom of the lake and count the microscopic types of pollen. And because there's often fires on the prairie here throughout history, we can actually directly date those pollen records. So you can get a look at this just happens to be Chatsworth Bog down in Livingston County, Illinois, but one of the sites studied in this 2006 article shown at lower left also includes Nelson Lake, Batavia, pretty close to you all. There are also good pollen studies for, is it Mammoth Lake, Colin? Is that correct? They're in Aurora?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's in
So
Phillips Park. Yep.
Okay. There you are. So you got a good prehistoric pollen study site right near you if you're from around Aurora. Abundance of different species or genus of veg were throughout history along timelines. And you can see as the spruce trees decline and oak becomes more prominent, and then oak declines and the grasses signifying the arrival of the tallgrass prairie as the dominant ecosystem over here. And how does this break out? Well, it looks something like this. About 18,000 years ago, the glaciers melt back. We're tundra here for somewhere around nearly 4,000 years, and the dates are not exact because there's transition periods. Then it goes to a swamp, and then to spruce forest for about 1,000 years. And after that, hardwood forest, ash elm deciduous forest. And that's one of the longest periods that we have in prehistory, this part of the country. That lasts from 13,000 to 8,500 years ago. And around 10,000 years ago, people arrive here to stay. I say to stay, I qualify it with that because you'll see just below the box on top, there's a broken piece of a projectile point. And that one is a part of a Dalton point. We found that on Medewin, and that dates to about 10,000 years ago. But just last summer, someone brought in, you'll see on the right there in that green piece of paper, brought into our welcome center. And they slapped a ruler on it and took a nice picture, but that probably dates closer to 12,000. So people were here for perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years before that, all the way back to the beginning of that ash elm forest period, the Paleo-Indian era. And but it was, we think, around 10,000 when people started to settle and specialize in the resources that were available to them in this wooded landscape. So the prairie began to pop up more or less as meadows, we think, amongst the hardwood forests about 8,500 years ago. And that era lasted for about 1,000 years as the land became somewhat drier and somewhat warmer. Then there was a cold period, and the prairie contracted, and the deciduous forest reasserted itself about 7,500 to 62 years ago. So the prairie state really became the prairie probably 12,000 years after the glaciers had melted back. There's 12,000 years of changes, and a lot of that time was a period of forest. People got here to a forested landscape. You'll see in the lower right, bison arrived as a regular, if not continuous, presence beginning about 4,450 years ago, and they were all gone before 1810. So the bison didn't get here until about 2,000 years after the prairie uh, as a regular visitor or inhabitant of the prairie. So that raises some interesting questions for environmental historians and certainly for archaeologists as well. I have to note there were two isolated specimens out in Whiteside County, and you can see that in red on the right-hand side of this screen. They were radiocarbon dated about 8,900 years ago. One of the questions that's always raised with those two specimens is, were they really living here, or because they're on a floodplain of the Mississippi, was they something that perhaps washed down, killed in the river, and that was where they happened to drift up ashore? And that we don't know. But there's, 4,500 years of silence in the record of bison after those two specimens before we start to see them pop up again. We'll look at some radiocarbon dates, but bison may have lived in Illinois in pulses or episodically throughout prehistory. And one of the things we see when we do some really detailed studies, paleontological and zooarchaeological studies, is difference in tooth wear patterns and stable isotope analysis, suggesting that they are not eating the same thing when they're east of the Mississippi on the tallgrass prairie that they lived on out west on the Great Plains and Northern Plains. So why were they not as abundant? And I'll note also that we don't think there were very abundant. There's no evidence to support there were a lot of bison here. We're thinking herds in the maybe dozens to maybe low hundreds at the most. But then after 1600, they become quite common, quite abundant on the tallgrass prairie. So why were they not as abundant earlier? Why did they become more common on the prairie after 1600-ish? And some of the answers, or some of the potential answers to that, are apparent decreases in human population during that period around 1300 AD. Possible climatic and ecological reasons. We're going through the Little Ice Age in that era, so it may have changed the preferred subsistence or what they were subsisting on, and served either, population pressures in the West may have kind of squeezed a growing population into the tallgrass prairies. We just don't know. We just don't really know. So probably more questions than answers on bison prehistorically. And one of the key things is we're looking at really wafer thin slices of time by archaeological and certainly by paleontological standards. So trying to learn more about them. But I guess the overarching message here is we shouldn't default to the shorthand. Where the glaciers left it 10,000 years ago, it became prairie, the bison got here and co-equally sculpted and made this the prairie state. Because the dates don't quite seem to line up, nor do the presence. This is a look at the radiocarbon dates, and you'll see that upper left-hand corner are the Anderson Peat Mine from Whitesides County. Those are those old, nearly 9,000-year-old specimens. The prairie arrives with that red vertical line marked prairie. And then you'll see the big period of silence in the archaeological and paleontological record for a couple of thousand years. Then they start to pop up in pulses, and you'll see that big pulse between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. We have a lot of specimens dated. And then over 1,000 years of silence in the record, and then they pop up again. In the later era, within the last 1,000 years, certainly. Interesting other thing, we talk about people and bison on the prairie, is what were people doing? Well, it's very interesting, I think, to an archaeologist and certainly to environmental historians that we started to see Native Americans in the what's called Eastern Agricultural Complex start to practice horticulture and probably agriculture right about the same time the bison got here. So some of the initial suite of cultivars that appear somewhere between 5,000 and 3,800 years ago is sunflower, Chenopodium, which we know as goosefoot or lamb's quarters. We still have it, not the subspecies that was common here in the early Eastern Agricultural Complex, but it's a relative of quinoa. So you can see one of the little kernels or seeds there of Chenopodium. Also, squash and pumpkins appear to be cultivated, and marsh elder, although marsh elder is part of the Eastern Agricultural Complex suite of cultivars, it is not found here now. It's a little more southerly in range. By 2,000 years ago, the suite of cultivars had expanded to erect knotweed, and this is not the Japanese knotweed if you're a gardener that you try to get out of your garden. This is a native species called erect knotweed. Also maygrass, a little more southerly in range, little barley, which you can see on a kind of a torched piece of ground growing on that one plant we have here, and amaranth. It's interesting that all of these plants are what's called ruderal species. That is, they're pioneer species, or they're species that grow on waste ground, such as that after fire or flood, or both. And there's some thought, is there an anthropogenic, is there a people caused reason to that? We've got all of these disturbed species, disturbed grounds loving species here that are brought into the suite of agricultural products. So, people caused it or people discovered it and they just facilitate that. We don't know. And the other interesting part about it is this is about co-equal to when the bison got here. This is from Bruce McMillan's Records of Early Bison in Illinois. He's the editor of it. And it is it's a few years now since that's been published, and there were at the time 133 sites, archaeological and paleontological, in Illinois that have bison. And it does not include Medewin. We have another species or another site that's out for dating right now from southern Kane County, or I'm sorry, Kendall County. And there's also another site, archaeological site, kind of a late pre-European contact site. And it really doesn't change the distribution of over time, and there's no new dates in there from that previous chart I showed you for the radiocarbon dates. Where are we on the environment? Well, Grand Prairie Division, Eastern Prairie Peninsula. This is from Schwegman's Natural Divisions of Illinois, and you can see where Medewin is. And you guys are a little further north if you're in Aurora, and you're kind of on the northeastern Morainal Division. And let's take a look at that. This is also the environmental areas, and the brown spot marked number 4 on the left is the Grand Prairie, is Eastern Prairie Peninsula. And then you can see in the middle all of those sites that have bison. And the interesting one is most of those bison are somewhere fairly near one of the major rivers in Illinois. You can see they're densely packed along the Illinois River, along the Sangamon, a few other rivers. There seem to be analogy. We don't know, or correlation there. And we don't know if that is, causal effect, if it just happens to be where we found the bison because those areas were less disturbed, weren't subject to agricultural practices down in the wooded bottoms and things like that in the floodplains, but we'll see. Interesting, in Ballou's 1996 work mentions or uses a wonderful phrase. It's a popular work of the history of bison in the east of the Mississippi, but it has some really striking phrases, including this one: compared to the great herds west of the Mississippi, buffalo east were hardly more than stragglers. Ironically, by the late 1500s, man had created the niche that permitted buffalo to enter the east. By the 1820s, man had destroyed. Let's look at some historical records. This is a map from the Library of Congress, 1778. Hutchins, who created this map at the time, was in the British Army and did this very extensive map. You can search libraryofcongress.gov. There'll be a search window on the left-hand side. You can select maps. On the right-hand side, just type in Hutchins, and then you can bore down on that. And it's pretty insightful. We'll kind of talk about other things, but a nice background to the historical record of bison in Illinois. Father Marquette, one of the first European Americans through the area, has a pretty long description, cut it down here, and of the bison that he found in the 1670s, calling them wild cattle. And interesting, because he does talk about human predation. He says they're very fierce, and not a year passes without their killing some savages. When attacked, they catch a man on their horns. If they can toss him in the air and then throw him on the ground, after which they trample him underfoot and kill him. If a person fire at them, he must immediately after the shot throw himself down and hide in the grass. If they perceive him who has fired, they run at him and attack him. They're scattered about the prairie in herds. So even that perhaps suggests that the numbers are not, they cover the prairie. The kind of descriptions we hear of the early European explorers who wrote down their first encounter with bison on the Great Plains. A little more detailed look at that map. We've zoomed down to the Tiakiki or Kankakee River. You can see that pink polygon with the blue outline is the outline of Medewin and where we are. Running up northward to Chicago is the Des Plaines River. And then downstream a little bit to the left, you can see where it says island. That is where it becomes the Illinois River. And the description Hutchins uses of this land in 1778 is level, rich lands intermixed with swamps and ponds. Okay, about what you'd expect. But when you go down to his description of the land around Bloomington, very large natural meadows, innumerable herds of buffaloes, elk, deer are found here. And I preserved his punctuation and capitalization there. So yes, there are bison here, but they don't seem to be evenly distributed across the landscape. So a little summary so far. People settled in the area over 10,000 years ago. Tallgrass prairie becomes the dominant ecosystem 6,200 years ago, roughly. Bison appear as an episodic or pulses of populations about 4,500 years ago, an increase after about the year 1600 during the Little Ice Age. Native Americans in this area do not get the horse until about 50 to 60 years before the bison are extirpated. Best evidence suggests that they're gone before 1810. Native Americans are removed from the land 1830. And we think that the bison herds in the Grand Prairie started out in the dozens, perhaps, and then after 1600 expanded to into the hundreds. But again, not these vast numbers of the herds that we're going to hear more about when we, in the second hour of this National Bison Day program, go out and talk to the folks in Montana. This is what we think of in Montana. This is a great, really dramatic depiction of the buffalo hunt. William Lee was a late 19th, early to mid 20th century sagebrush Rembrandt artist. This painting, famous painting, comes from the Buffalo Bill Historic Center in Cody, Wyoming. there's a lot more drama here than there is perhaps historical accuracy. Uh, I kind of like this, and the more I learn about bison, I'm on the bison handling team at Medewin, and I've had the opportunity to, spend some time with Kelly has given me the opportunity. Kelly Gutnick, our herd manager, to work with the bison, and I will tell you right now, the guy in the lower left is the toughest man that ever lived because he's facing down what could be up to a 1-ton charging and terrified bull bison at full speed with something that looks like an oversized baseball bat. I, for one, haven't been close to angry and agitated bull bison, would not want to be forcing him off the edge of a cliff using a baseball bat. And I used to think he was the toughest guy that ever lived until I look behind him and I see there's 3 people there. You can see 2 of them clearly, and one of them's kind of doubled over in the middle. And they're waving little, look to be maybe rabbit pelts at the bison to make them go over the cliff. And then you can see as the bison are kind of, floating in air down this buffalo jump, down below, people are sitting on horses, kind of waiting for these 1,000 to 2,000 pound animals to plunge at their feet. And I will tell you that we will learn more about the buffalo jump, I think, when the First Peoples Buffalo Jump State Park folks talk to us a little later today. But they're not sitting down there while 1,000-pound gristle and muscle bags are coming off at them. This is kind of more what the overall thing looked like, which is the First Peoples Buffalo Jump State Park, a topographic relief map. You can see that little red dot to the right is kind of that's the kill area, or that's the kill site. And they would have had miles of gathering basins, drive lines to gradually work the animals up to the point where they could get them to move quickly and densely to the point where those in the front of the herd could not stop and wound up pushed off the edge of the cliff to the east there. There's another site, enormous site, the Head Smashed In site in Alberta, Canada. A lot of good interpretive stuff. It has a good diagram, so I included that. So this was certainly a way that a lot of bison were procured, even in days before, and perhaps even more in days before the introduction of the horse out of the Great Plains. But they were a commonly used method, but something that we don't have that kind of terrain in Illinois. We don't have that kind of terrain anywhere in the east of the Mississippi region, certainly not to take advantage of on a large scale. We used it a little different, we being the Illinoisans of prehistory, pre-European contact. Native Americans probably, or we know, selectively burned the prairie. We mentioned how they may have done it to practice horticulture and agriculture. There's a lot of research lately that they may have done it to maintain the variety of resources available by maintaining ecotones between prairie, savanna, and woodland areas of the state. And they certainly used it to flush game. And interesting, this article on the lower right-hand side suggests that, and it's an article, a late buffalo jump, about a late buffalo jump, early historic era. And they have a very, very fine-grained record of this site in north central Montana. And you can find that. The full article is online through the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and just a couple of years ago. And it suggests that, we think of, okay, burning, you see this chaotic scene in the George Catlin painting depicted at center. But it seems that in that case, the Native Americans on the Great Plains were burning the prairies a year in advance near the gathering basins, so that the following year, bison would be drawn to that new, fresh sprouting grass, which we know they are and were, and that it would have drawn them into the gathering basins so they could then be moved through the gathering basins, drive lines, and over the edge. So it's really strategic and fine-grained. It's not just torching off the prairies and then charging away, trying to stay ahead of the fire. We think here there were probably 2 bison seasons per year. We get good burning seasons at Medewan, where we do a lot of burning of the prairie in the spring. And there's another period in the fall and winter. And you certainly are going to avoid bison hunting during calving season, when the cows get very, very agitated and a lot less predictable. And also, you're going to avoid the midsummer rut, when the bulls and the cows are also distracted by other concerns, and where you're not going to move them in a very predictable or orderly manner anywhere during that season. Plus, they were farmers, and the later you get, after the year roughly 1000, they're corn farmers, and they have a pretty strict regime of when they have to get the corn planted, when they have to get the corn harvested, when during the summer they may need to irrigate it. It's a pretty environmentally driven or agriculturally driven seasonal round that these people are working on. You'll see the account. We have it from Deliette and LaSalle in the 1600s, and then again Nicolas Perrault in the mid 19th century, and they talk about using fire in the east, that is east of the Mississippi, to catch bison. And I won't read that to you, but you can read that.
And Joe, we got a question in the chat.
Okay.
Susan's asking, what is a drive line?
Drive line would be, so the gathering basins, you would move the bison into that, just kind of start to move them in the direction you want them to. You're not constraining or constricting the herd at all at that point. As you start to move them into the drive lines, it gets very directional, and they become somewhat more narrowly constrained. That is, it's they're parallel lines of either, it need only be cairns or stones or people positioned to kind of get the bison moving in one direction in a little more of a stream, if you will, rather than a big section of a herd where they're just kind of milling about. And I hope that, does that answer? Is that Susan? I can't see the chat box, so I'm dependent on Colin to read to me. Okay, thank you. I got it. I was able to open that.
Sure.
Another thing, Illinois, this is, I showed you the toughest man that ever lived, standing there with a baseball bat on a charging bull bison. And behind him, also some pretty tough hombres who were, waving him in with a rabbit pelt. This is probably something that people thought Native Americans did in Illinois. In this case, second toughest group of individuals who ever lived are swimming. They have bison swimming across a river, and then they're swimming up on them with knives in their teeth to climb up on their backs. And you can see not the one in the foreground, but the one just behind it to the right, there's a Native American. He's climbed up on a bison's back and is stabbing him to death while a terrified 2,000-pound bison swims across a river. Probably not exactly like that, but in any event, we do have historical records of, or we do have archaeological records of what we think was bison being procured at the edges of rivers, however. And South Illinois River, south of Peoria, maybe 15 years ago, Terry Martin and Alan Harn excavated a site. They found a bison on the bank of the river near Peoria. And when they were excavating it, they found the tip of a projectile point. And that style and type of projectile point, and the date that they got was about 2,400 years ago. They found a spear point that had passed through a rib and lodged into a vertebra in this bison that they found on the bank of the Illinois River. So very interesting. That's Terry Martin, probably the most prominent zoo archaeologist and current expert on prehistoric Native American use and historic as well use of faunal resources. And he's kind of the bison guy. He's my go-to guy for questions currently in prehistoric bison. And a really good individual. Works with us every year. And he's examining the jaw of that bison back in his lab at the Illinois State Museum, where he's the curator of, he was the curator of anthropology at the time. So they were hunting them along the rivers, and that's probably a spear point rather than an arrow point. And it was done, but probably not by climbing up on their backs and stabbing them to death with a knife while they're swimming. So you're a Native American. Congratulations. However you did it, you've succeeded in the dangerous undertaking of procuring a bison. So now you got something that weighs between 800 and 2,000 pounds, and it's lying there in the sun, and it could be bringing you somewhere between 225 and upwards of 1,000 pounds of meat, as well as some hide and some bone for other tools. What's your plan? Well, one of the things that had to be part of the plan was you got this big animal there and you have to reduce it so you can use these things. So first you skin the animal, and then one would guess a group of individuals stake out that hide and begin to scrape and prepare it, as well as another group of individuals butcher the meat, cut it into strips, and then have to dry it. So you can get it from where you procure it, maybe down the river in Illinois, to where you need it, which is back home. And remember, most of this, bison, or I should say horses, not being here until around the year 1750. Native Americans are not using wheeled vehicles. There is no refrigeration. So you have some challenges. Another little summary chart here. So we have low bison populations, danger, unpredictability of when they're available because you haven't got very many and the herds aren't very large. Logistical difficulties. You have to consider all these when we're trying to figure out how people procured and used bison in Northeast Illinois. So one of the other things about the stream crossing methodology, if you catch them when they're stream crossing, you want to catch them because they're less mobile on mud banks and while crossing the stream, but by the same token, you're less mobile too. So think of yourself trying to skin and butcher 1,000+ pound animal hip deep in mud. So something we probably don't understand, or we do not understand as to how do you really get around some of the difficulties in doing that. We think they certainly, historic evidence suggests that they were flushed by anthropogenic fires to kill sites. Probable large group activities in 2 cycles of the year, 2 seasons of the year, and they may have traveled quite a ways from where they lived in order to get bison in the region. We don't have bison jumps, buffalo jumps here in the Grand Prairie. And I'll introduce something, if you're already familiar with it, then bear with me, but it's called the Schlepp effect, which is kind of humorous, but kind of plausible, which says you're not going to carry extra things beyond what you need back home if all you need is, you're only going to carry home what you need. The Schlepp effect came from the 1968 article in Scientific American about a hunter's village in Neolithic Turkey. And it suggests that you're carrying back with you or carrying as little as you need to carry of something. If you don't have that, as I said, horses, refrigeration, wheeled vehicles, your choices become somewhat limited what to do with that upwards of 2,000 pound animal. And this is a photo of Jim Saltner of Edmonton, Alberta. He's got a pet bison named Bailey D. Buffalo Jr. and keeps him in the house. But he figured out clearly how to get him to between the stove and the kitchen table, although that's not what he's going to use him for. But, some insights are offered by Pierre Deliette. He's a French officer who later commanded the French garrison at what's now called Starved Rock in the early 1700s. He describes the local Native Americans killed over 120 buffaloes, from which they brought back 100 tongues. So they remained a week in order to dry all the meat. And he goes into some detail, which you can read as I talk. It's more important than what I'm saying, really. And kind of skinning it, putting it on a cradle, kindling a little fire under it, drying it for a day, and then kind of folding it up, making it easier to carry back to where they needed it to be. And Colin, if you can tell me, if you folks will, can you do a thumbs up, or have you got enough time to have read that?
Did you say enough time to read that, or?
Yeah. Did everyone have a chance? Anyone have a chance? I think we've left it on there enough to get a look
Oh,
at
yeah.
how that was.
Yeah, I was able to read it.
Okay, let's do a little math here. Math is always a fun thing, right? So an average bison weighs about 1,100 pounds. Bulls are a little less, or I'm sorry, cows are a little less on average. Bulls are a little more, but there's fewer bulls typically. Dressed carcass, a commercially dressed carcass nowadays, bison ranchers get about 616 pounds of primal cuts out of it. We're assuming that they would have cut the parts that were more prized and less easy to dry in that manner, such as liver, tongues, and hump meat. You consume them on site once you get one of the bison. You're figuring you get about 465 pounds of meat out of that 1,100 pound carcass. Again, that's a commercial yield. Native Americans were probably eating more of the bison than a bison rancher provides. There's almost 500 calories in each pound of bison meat. So times 465 pounds gives you upwards of 250,000 calories available if you can figure out a way to get that home. You can, however, reduce it to between 20 and 30% of its original weight. And we'll look at that as a medium of about 116 pounds. You're going to be using the hide to carry it home. That'll dry out between 8 and 25 pounds, depending on how dry and how skinned you prepare it. So call that a median of 16.5. Let's call it 10 pounds of bones that you need to use for other things, such as scapula, if you want to bring some ribs back for rasps, things like that. So if you can figure out a way to carry 142 pounds back, you can get nearly 250,000 pounds of food, as well as useful hide and other parts. So that's surely an improvement over the 1,100 pounds of bison you wound up with right after the kill. This is, it's a cool photo, but it's also, I think, instructive on the upper left. These are young men carrying a pig from one place to another, using a shoulder carried pole. You can see that shoulder carried pole reflected in a 19th century illustration of Native Americans carrying a deer back. But you can also see, if you imagine that hog is a bison, and instead of a live whole hog, you have a bison hide, and it's filled with dried meat. You can see the importance of leaving the hoof bones on that hide in order to facilitate carrying it back. One of the other things I'd like to bring out was if the bison are more abundant further down the Illinois River, and certainly Native Americans were using a lot of canoe for transportation when they did not have horses. And so you're probably carrying it to the edge of the Illinois River and then working your way back up the river with your bison. So minimizing the amount of time you have to carry it on your shoulders. Other alternative possibly is people are trading for it. And that'll bring us specifically, or they're buying it, use here, specifically the site at Medewin, the Middle Grant Creek site. I'll talk about that a little bit. But this must have been a big event in the life cycle, in the seasonal cycle that Native Americans in Northeast Illinois experienced. Large, complex, dangerous operation, and no guarantee you're going to come back with a bison or that you're not going to lose some members of your small band. Site we have on Medewin, which really helps us understand that, is a very late what's called Huber phase, and it's called Huber based on the distinctive trailing on the pottery. You can see that on the right, and the tempering of the pottery. It dates to about the year 1600. In the past 4 going on 5 years, Notre Dame has been working on this. We get some scapula bones, and very interesting, the scapula bones and suggest that they were used as hoes. So the one bone that's really prized, and you can leave the rest of that bison skeleton on the prairie out in around Peoria, Bloomington area, if you can get home the scapula, and you're going to need the hoof bones. And in fact, we also, as at many of these lake pre-contact sites, find hoof bones. Native Americans here had other ways rather than as the Great Plains where you needed to use every part of the bison. This is a polished, that little piece in the center photograph at the bottom is a polished ischium from a beaver, probably used as a straightener or an abrader of some sort. So we see a lot of other things used that would have been, bison bone would have been pressed into service for out on the Great Plains. But they have a lot of options here. We also find evidence of all of these animals being eaten here locally. So almost all we find on these late pre-contact sites are scapulas and hoof or foot bones. So by 1808, bison are gone from anywhere east of the Mississippi by 1820. Of course, Native American, by the late 1800s, there are no bison being commercially hunted. This is in 1876, near the end of this era, illustration from Harper's Weekly, and the small caption shows the bison kind of weird, but I think it's interesting too. And the bison is peeling off his robe and saying, "Don't shoot, my good fellow. Here, take my robe, save your ammunition, and let me go in peace." By 1884, 325 bison left in the U.S., including the 25 at Yellowstone. I'd like to thank Dr. Terry Martin, Curator Emeritus of Illinois State Museum, Chris Widga, East Tennessee State University, and Deanne Watt at the Illinois State Museum, and Colin here, and the rest of the folks at the Aurora Public Library. So do we have any questions I can answer? If you want to ask me any question by email, if we run out of time, that's my email in the lower left.
Bill in the chat.
And okay.
Bill in the chat
Links.
wants to know if there's a place where he can find the links that were referenced in your presentation.
Bill, if you would send me an email at the address joseph.wheeler@usda.gov and tell me which of the links you'd be interested, I will resend those to you happily. And the same goes to anyone else on the chat here.
Joe, thank you for this is an awesome presentation. Incredible information that you shared today. Our presentation was recorded and it'll probably go up on the library website for viewing later if anybody wants to review it. Otherwise, I will probably see everyone over at the next presentation.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Come out and see us at Medewin.